Good evening and welcome to this episode of the Bastani Factor. My name is Aaron Bastani. This evening I have the great pleasure, I must be frank, of being joined by Michael Walker. How you doing, Michael?
I'm very well. How are you?
Very good. Twitter handle, @MichaelJ Walker.
JS.
Jay, you've changed it, haven't you?
No, there was already a Michael J. Walker, so I had to add an S. Doesn't even stand for anything. It's just James, shortened.
I was going to say, I presume you do have a middle name.
Well, the middle name is James.
Yeah, so it does stand for something.
Yeah, but the S doesn't. You know what I mean?
I see.
Maybe you would think I was called Michael James Stephen Walker or something like that.
Oh, that'd be quite cool, actually. Is that something you thought about before? Sort of a second middle name?
No, and I'd take a bit of time and think of something more original than Stephen, I think, if it were to be the case.
Stephen's
if I needed another one.
It's very much kind of LGBT Blairite name. Isn't it?
Stephen is an LGBT.
Stephen, it is. No, it is. It's a very new Labour name, full stop, actually. Stephen Doty, Stephen Kinnock.
Stephen Twigg.
Stephen Twigg.
Who was...
Maybe that's... If you want a safe seat, Michael, these are the sorts of sacrifices people need to make. Stephen Walker. Party time with me, Stephen Walker.
You think I'd have better career prospects if I was called Stephen than Michael?
I think, well, from that perspective of trying to play that game, I mean, that horse has probably left the stable. I think doing like DIY, here's how you completely get rid of a right-wing CLP executive. Here's how you may want to reselect your MP. I think that's probably, I think you...
the battle inside the Labour Party has been won, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
the horse has left the stable.
In more ways than one, yes. That's quite right. But there are even bigger struggles ahead of us, Michael.
What are they? What are the biggest struggles we're facing, Aaron?
Well, you might not know this, but Britain's scheduled to leave the European Union on March the 29th. So, that's quite a big deal, isn't it?
Apparently. I mean, people just keep going on about it. 5 days of debates. 5 days.
Oh, there's on the One show, I've not been watching it today, but there's a Brexit takeover.
No.
What does that look like?
Well, I don't know. It would have happened already. No, it's at 7 p.m.
Yeah, but we can't show anything that's like big with the BBC. If we put it onto YouTube, they'll just do the copyright. But what is that? A Brexit takeover? What is it?
Well, it means that instead of Brexit being talked about in the miserable House of Commons, it's now going to all of the BBC studios. You can't even watch entertainment TV without Brexit.
We've had a Brexit takeover for 2 fucking years on every channel.
Did they talk about it on soap operas? Brexit. I'm not watching any at the moment, so I wouldn't know.
Everywhere. Can I just say, by the way, before we carry on, I'm really happy this evening because for once, Michael has the Butters chair, and I don't. Which is just a huge thing for me. So we're going to try and answer 5 questions today, I think. Are we going to try and do that?
I'm happy to.
We're going to try and answer 5 questions today. Very, very pertinent questions. Whether or not you're a Labour member, supporter, voter, I hope you're at least a third. Whether or not you would vote Leave or Remain or voted Leave or Remain last time. I think these are very, very salient to the left generally. They are as follows. Is the government about to collapse? That's the first question. Big question. Does the demonstration on the 9th of December, this Sunday, matter? That's of course confronting the far right Tommy Robinson as he tries to become the tribune of the 52% of this country, or so he thinks. Thirdly, should Labour come out for a second referendum? Is now the moment to make a left case against the EU? If there is ever a moment to do that, which isn't 2016, which obviously didn't happen. And finally, has the media response to yesterday's awful day for the Tories been even worse than you might have expected? And I guess in a way, that last question perhaps makes for a good second question. Because I'll tell you what.
You can reorder them if you want.
Yeah, because obviously the events of yesterday would suggest the government is about to collapse. Not that it's likely, but it looks a hell of a lot more likely after the last 24 hours. So yesterday the government lost 3 votes. It was found to be in contempt of Parliament. Well, that's probably going to be the Attorney General ultimately. It probably he'll be the full guy, which is quite funny. The last MP found to be in contempt of Parliament. The last 2 were both Tories. The last one to be expelled from the Commons for contempt was like 70 years ago. I mean, he could be expelled. That's kind of funny.
You don't get expelled if you get found in contempt of Parliament, do you?
One did 70 years ago.
Wow.
But that's because he was leaking stories to journalists. And also it's the government that's been found in contempt, but ultimately it's going to have to be, apparently, like, there's going to have to be, ultimately will rest on, like, one person.
I didn't know that it was a punishable thing. I thought it was just a
There's a motion.
I thought it's just a motion of censure, yeah.
Well, so like a government's never been found to be in contempt of Parliament because like nobody's ever thought of doing it before, kind of thing. The point is the government executed a strategy which was decided upon by a set of people. Ultimately, they're going to be accountable. So it's maybe look, if you want to get in the questions at the end of this, and we can go over that. But that's how it looks and sounds to me. So the 3 votes, they were found to be in contempt. Perhaps most importantly, the DUP are now saying they don't really have much confidence in Theresa May. You have positive noises from the DUP actually towards Jeremy Corbyn yesterday as well and today, saying that, look, he's saying really positive things about the Northern Irish question, about, Britain and Northern Ireland being treated the same in any post-Brexit scenario. So this would suggest that a general election is more possible than some might think, isn't it, Michael?
Well, I mean, what's interesting, so if you watched any of the BBC shows or Channel 4 shows a couple of weeks ago, when Labour said what we want is a general election, they were treated with, like what they were saying was mad. This idea, yeah, you say you want a general election, but that's a ridiculous demand. Now, 50-50. The BBC are preparing their general election coverage in case it happens. So it does look like the government could fall. We're in one of those situations where basically every single outcome seems quite unlikely, but one of them's got to happen. So the DUP is saying if this deal passes, then they will withdraw their support for the government. So that would mean the government would fall. If this deal doesn't pass, then obviously Theresa May is in her very own stalemate. So she's going to have to, either come up with a new deal that doesn't lose the support of the DUP, or call a general election, or call a referendum. So there aren't any outcomes where she stays as Prime Minister. There aren't any outcomes where she stays as Prime Minister.
Well, there's 3 outcomes, right? There's hard Brexit, no deal, there's a referendum, or there's a general election.
Hard Brexit, no deal, or referendum, or a general election?
Yeah.
Okay. What would the first one look like? Hard Brexit.
Well, How would that happen? No deal would be a managed no deal, as we've talked about many times on the show before. It wouldn't be a no deal for aviation and the City of London, etc. Probably key goods like medicines and so on.
And that happens if there's a stalemate in Parliament until the 29th of March, right?
Yeah.
So Theresa May hangs on. She just keeps losing these votes. And she says, fine, Parliament are not assenting to my deal. So I told you what would happen, and it's going to happen. We're going to have a no deal.
And the major thing is, so the conversation in regards to the parliamentary arithmetic is somebody saying a fourth option, revoke Article 50. Okay, fine. Stop Brexit is also an option, yes, but that's currently not on the table for the Tories, at least. What was I going to say? That was a bit of a curveball there, the one that said revoke Article 50. That's absolutely
You're
true,
on the next one, which is no deal. No, you've had no deal. Your other one was hard Brexit.
So basically the first vote, which is December the 11th, the presumption is she'll lose, but if she loses by 50, that's apparently a success now. If she loses by 100, if she loses by 150, she may have to resign. I mean, this is all just picked out of people's asses, right? Nobody actually knows. The thinking amongst the Tories is, well, if she loses by 50, then the discipline of the markets, run on the pound, all the bad news, press releases about why this deal is so great, has to have the support of the country, yada, yada, yada. That would just about get it through the second time round.
Oh, if it's 50?
If it's 50.
Okay.
If it's 100, that won't happen, presumably. But what a sort of a period of tumult might mean in the aftermath of March 29th, when we leave without a deal, you could have something very similar where they'll say, okay, well, this kind of panic we tried to induce in December didn't discipline the country, didn't discipline the ERG, didn't discipline the Labour Party sufficiently to do what we want. So actually, you know what? Let's just fucking crash the economy for a couple of weeks and see what happens. Like, literally tailbacks, in Calais and Dover and making border crossings more difficult, etc. I don't think they'll pursue that sort of strategy, but that would merely represent a sort of intensification of what they're already planning to do between the first vote on the 11th and the second one. God knows when that'll happen. Because Theresa May, a year ago, was not thinking, I will rely on the capital markets and the foreign exchange markets to discipline my own party. So I think we've gone this far. Why wouldn't we go further still? So that's no deal. Then there's the referendum. She might think 3 options on the table, Chequers being one of them. might act as a way of, again, disciplining her own party. Either it's this Brexit or no Brexit. And if the country chooses hard Brexit, then she's not to blame.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, a general election. Labour, I think, would almost certainly win. But ultimately, the Tories can, with some reason, say, well, last year was an outlier. We might be able to squeeze a majority of 5, given everything that's happening. And again, it's all contingent on disciplining the population at large through a Project Fear.
Would you want Labour to do Brexit? I mean, would you prefer actually the Tories to take the hit? This vote eventually a deal gets passed in, say, February. It's not a particularly good one, but then ultimately we as a country move on, and then we can have a political argument about something else after Theresa May has taken all that damage.
But we don't move on after March 29th, do we? Because this is about leaving, and then the future arrangement comes afterwards. So some might say, well, look, we should accept this deal. Well, actually, it's a perfectly legitimate argument. We should accept Theresa May's deal because ultimately they take the hit for it. Like, the Tory base hates this deal. They take the hit for it. And then ultimately, whoever forms the next government, and it wouldn't be them because her own party hates her because we've just backed checkers, would decide the sort of future trading relationship with the EU. There's a good, strong argument there politically, but it's a bit eight dimensions.
Actually, the best one is that we go out, I mean, thinking from a purely cynical strategic perspective, is that she passes the withdrawal agreement. That does so much political damage that then eventually we get a general election. Then Labour's come in. The unpopular bits happen because I think the withdrawal agreement is going to be the most difficult because after 2 years, I think people have come to terms with the idea that we're going to be in the customs union, that we can't make our own trade deals. I mean, the DUP probably won't be... Well, I mean, if we have a new government, the DUP won't be propping it up. It's not likely. And then we'll have...
Why would it not be likely?
Well, I mean, just because the maths. I mean, you need a very specific parliamentary outcome for the DUP to be the key player. I mean, Labour could get a majority. If Labour have a minority, they could get the Lib Dems to put them over.
But they've got 12 seats. I mean, that's quite a lot. That could be the difference between if the two other parties are looking neck and neck, which is what the polls at the moment suggest.
No, it could be. But what I'm saying is, if this withdrawal agreement goes through, and then you have to have a final deal, then we can easily imagine a situation where the DUP are no longer a relevant party in Parliament, as they have never really been before this anyway.
That's not true.
When else were they?
John Major's government after '93 basically didn't have a majority. It was relying on unionist votes to get things through. After, like, it was having so many backbench rebellions that it had a sort of de facto wrong Latin, ad hoc deal with the DUP.
But anyway, we can imagine very easily a government that's not backed by the DUP if there's another general election between now and the end of the withdrawal agreement. Then they just make a new deal where the whole Northern Ireland issue isn't that big a deal because you just have some regulatory borders in the Irish Sea, which only the DUP care about. The population of Northern Ireland, according to Dawn Foster, which I think sounds completely plausible, don't give a shit if there's border regulation between Northern Ireland and Britain, because it actually puts them in a very competitively advantageous situation because they have access both to the UK and to the EU.
Yeah.
So that's the outcome. We'll have a new general election. The DUP won't be required to prop up a government, and then problem solved. Easy.
Okay. You convinced me.
Yeah.
So yesterday, I said that the government was defeated 3 times. Apparently, it hasn't happened on a single day for 40 years. And here's a great fact, because we're going to talk about the media coverage now. Gordon Brown, Prime Minister from 2007 to 2009. How many times did he lose parliamentary votes?
I've got no idea.
In those 2 years. Apparently, actually, no, sorry, it's not 2007 to 2009. 2007 to 2010. In those 3 years, given he was such a mess, a nightmare, Labour were a car crash under Gordon Brown. How many times were Labour defeated in the House of Parliament? The House of Commons?
You got to tell me, Aaron. 3.
3 times.
Oh.
Which is how many times Theresa May was defeated
in one day.
In one day. And so compare how Gordon Brown was being covered. You know, it's all over the place. The one-eyed Scot, all this mad stuff that the print media especially was saying about him. And, you know, it really does give you context what's going on right now. It's unprecedented. And then, obviously, alongside that, you do have a street mobilisation coming this Sunday. We'll talk about that later on with Tommy Robinson. These are very, very unique times in British politics, aren't they? I know we keep on saying it, but...
No, I think it's unheard of a situation where no one can see what outcome is possible, where you've just got a load of impossible paths in terms of what the future will bring. But you're right. I mean, I think the media have given her a bit of an easy ride, considering she lost 3 parliamentary votes in a day. No one in the media is really calling for her to stand down, are they?
No.
Whereas it's convention that if you can't maintain the confidence of the Commons, which she clearly can't, then you're going to have a new government. I mean, everyone's just giving her an easy ride. She's just going to lose vote after vote after vote after vote for weeks.
Yeah.
And that's going to be acceptable.
Look, take your mind back to summer 2016. Jeremy Corbyn goes to an Arsenal football match. He wears an Arsenal home strip from the 97-98 season. The media would have said, that kit is 18 years old. Will you resign? You know, they were asking him to resign over the most banal, puerile, stupid shit. And yet Theresa May suffered 3 parliamentary defeats in one day, and like I say, not a peep. And what really summed it up for me was, who's that guy? Tom Swarbrick at LBC?
I don't know.
Tom Swarbrick at LBC. He was previous to LBC, then he became her head of broadcast. So he worked for Theresa May. He then obviously, because last year was a shit show and he doesn't want to be remembered by everybody as fucking useless and sorry, too late, you worked for her. And sort of he backed the wrong horse. He goes back to LBC. Yesterday, he's interviewing a Tory minister who's saying everything's fine. And then like LBC say, da 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 da. Minister says, Tory bullshit artist minister tells Tory bullshit artist former Theresa May comms advisor, everything's fine. Oh wow, thank you. This is really committed, dispassionate journalism. Amazing. Really holding their feet to the fire. What's going on? And then the lead story again on LBC was the Corbyn anti-Semitism stuff. Because they had this Theo Usherwood.
Yesterday?
Yesterday. Theo
Jesus.
Usherwood, you know that dossier they had?
What, the one about...
The one
the one that was leaked from the...
They combed Twitter. No, because LBC compiled this, right? With certain other groups.
Yes.
They combed Twitter and they took all this data to the police. Now, some of these people may already have been in contact with the police. Other people may have done it. It said, we have no idea. They gave this dossier of evidence to the police. And then every couple of months, they go back to the police and they say, how's the dossier? What's going on? And Cressida Dick will say, yes, we're looking into it. Somebody may be guilty of racism here, or somebody may have broken the law. And then that's their headline. And this isn't news. That is not news. A radio station combing Twitter for things, sending it to the police, and every several months asking for updates isn't news.
Surely that wasn't the number one news story.
It was the number one story on Labour yesterday. Well, that's not true. I mean, because the no confidence. It was one of the major stories on Labour yesterday. Theo Usher was the political editor. He was tweeting about it a lot. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. What's your thoughts on LBC? I know you'd probably like a radio station. Look, the first possible opportunity, Michael's gone. Out Navarro door, never see him again at LBC. I'll see him high-fiving James O'Brien on Instagram.
LBC's an interesting one. I like listening to it. It's weird. It's interesting the way they have the different shows. So you have James O'Brien, who's obsessed with Remain, who just repeats himself over and over again. So every day is him saying how Leavers are stupid and how we should remain.
Yeah.
And then every day you have Nigel Farage in the evening saying, Remainers are stupid, we should leave. But they never interact with one another. So you never get particularly useful debate. You just have to imagine what would happen if the 10 a.m. guy had a debate with the 7 p.m. guy, but listening to it is all just incredibly repetitive.
Do you reckon they've put them that far away so they don't sort of meet each other in like the dining hall or something? Might be like a bust up.
There would be probably, wouldn't there? No, there wouldn't. Do you think Nigel Farage gets into fist fights?
No.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think James O'Brien does either.
But it's not just those two. You know, I told you that there was the James Swarbrick guy who's former Theresa May person, Majid Nawaz, who's tweeting at Ash yesterday, and he's basically comparing Ash to Tommy Robinson. He did that in one of his tweets. Wow.
He also completely lied in one of those tweets because he said, we never claimed to have de-radicalised Tommy Robinson, and people got up on Twitter today. They found where they'd said, de-radicalisation is a process and he's definitely on that path.
They said that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, they expended a lot of political capital on this idea that they had got Tommy Robinson to leave the EDL and he was now on a process of de-radicalisation.
Majid Nawaz is literally the most boring radio presenter in the country. I actually agree with him on lots of stuff. Not the big P politics, but like, well, he often has a bit of common sense because he is an actual liberal. There are not many of them, right? he has common sense on some stuff, like freedom of speech. I'm a bit more open, as you are, right? I think I'm a bit more open on that stuff than I think quite a bit of the left is. But fuck me, he's boring. He just picks up the most boring shit, and it's like he's like, oh, people are having an issue with this person's son dressed up as Aladdin for Halloween, and now people are calling him racist. What do you think? And I'm thinking, wow, this is your fucking life. You talk about this meaningless garbage all the fucking time. Sad.
I was just saying they just got Majid Nawaz's comment about Tommy Robinson up on the screen. Do you want to get that up again, Gary? So this is what they said about Tommy Robinson. Well, it's gone now. Doesn't matter.
Oh, no, it's up. Yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
I mean, what you're talking about is the way that on LBC they just get their content from Twitter, right? So they just find a really random kind of identitarian leftist. They say this person said this, or they find someone who's sort of like a transphobic parent. They say this person said this. Yeah. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Whilst ignoring
90% of the public don't really give a fuck about that stuff.
90% of the public don't give a fuck about Brexit, do they? I can barely muster the
I
energy.
reckon 60%.
60% don't.
Aren't passionately invested. No. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not. Are you?
I'm not. No.
I mean, no, none of my sort of people outside the sort of politics world. I mean, they don't really care that much.
Our future trading relationship with the European Union is not my political priority right now.
Oh, really? What is?
What is?
Yeah. What's your political priority?
It'd be getting a leftist government so that we can transform the economy.
But to do what?
What
would be what's your priority? Like Ash would say, about a new form of anti-racist politics which transcends traditional sort of liberal platitudes. What would yours be?
I'd say we completely transform the economy, so we're investing in parts of England that are outside of London. I'd say we're trying to heal the social divide so that we can have class unity among those people who've been screwed over by neoliberalism. And you're going to do that via primarily economic policy, but once you're going down that route and people have more money in their pockets, that's when you can start. I mean, you can do from the beginning, but that's when you more sort of like explicitly celebrate pluralism, when you explicitly can have an anti-racist politics, because you've generated some unity amongst the British working class or everyone who's been screwed over by neoliberalism, which is quite a lot of people.
You basically want to bring people together.
Yeah, I know. I'm a bit of a hippie.
You're a healer. You're a lover. Not a fighter.
That's why I can't handle Brexit, Aaron. It's just tearing families apart.
Is it?
Well, it's not. No, but because I don't think there's many families where there's like Leavers and Remainers who are passionate about it.
It reminds me of US politics, and we never really understood it. But like in the US, there were almost totally different universes, right, in terms of Republican Democrat vote, and incommensurable worlds. We never really had that in this country, and I think sort of Remain Leave is probably the first example of it. And in London, people go, well, of course we'll have a second referendum. Everybody's Remain now. And it's like, no. All the people who were voting Remain, and they were the people that you were talking to, because London was, 65% Remain? I don't know. Quite high, 60%?
Well, London had quite low turnout, though. So, I mean, it was incredibly high Remain. So if you were someone who was strategizing for a second referendum, I think more important than people who changed their minds would be people who didn't particularly turn out. So the demographics that were pro-Remain turned out to a much lower extent than the demographics that tended to vote Leave. So I mean, if you change turnout, that could make a difference.
In terms of my priority, people are talking about all these comments. We'll come to these later. Obviously, people are listening to this as a podcast as well, not live on video. People on their comments on YouTube are mentioning other issues that are their political priorities, transport, etc. Mine would probably be public transport. My absolute number one national infrastructure priority will be ultra cheap, high-speed trains across the whole country. I want to be able to get to Bournemouth in 1 hour. Because I don't want to live in this rainy shithole anymore. Well, actually, I don't. Who am I kidding? I live in Portsmouth.
But I mean, that's because you live in Portsmouth and you work in London. But do you think if you just have a load of high-speed trains that are going, even if they go to the whole rest of the UK, if they're just going to London, then that's going to centralise more of the economy in London.
Every train we already have should just be a high-speed train. I'm not saying have 1 or 2 tracks. It should be like the French. We need basically a national train infrastructure like the French TGV. So basically, you want to go any major urban area, you can get there with a high-speed train. And it's cheap. And it's, public luxury, like Scandinavian
You can get
trains.
some of the alt-centrists on side with that vision.
No, because they're full of shit.
That's what Jeremy Cliff was saying. The manifesto should be HS1, HS2, HS3, HS4 and HS5.
Really?
Yeah. That was a couple of years ago when he was saying this would be a genuinely radical manifesto. I think it's when he launched the party, Radical.
Yeah, but he thinks they should be privately owned, I presume, or not.
I don't know. You'd have to ask him.
I think they should be they should obviously operate at a loss. They should be very cheap, And also, look, I mean, have you been to Glasgow?
I've never been. I'd like to go to Glasgow.
Have you been to Newcastle?
No, I've only been through Newcastle when I was going to Edinburgh once.
Okay. I'm asking you where you've been, Michael. Have you been to Belfast?
No.
You've been to Dublin?
Yes.
You've been to Dublin? Okay, fine. That's not in the UK, but okay. You've been to Liverpool, of course. You've been to Bournemouth?
No.
All of these places you've not been to.
You need to take me on a tour, Aaron.
No, but it's because the other people in other countries, in Germany and Sweden, when you say, people are like, wow, you really haven't been to anywhere in your own country. You go, yeah, because it's too fucking expensive. For the same price, I can get a flight to Rome. A day return, peak.
Now you sound like you want to bring people together, Aaron.
Oh, that's true. Hey.
Via trains. Via publicly owned, very cheap, very, very fast railways.
Which is just really vision. Nice. They kind of look like a sort of a Nordic furniture advert. High-speed internet. Great coffee. Serve breakfast on the train. I don't drink coffee anymore even. That's how altruistic I am. I want you to have great coffee. So, anyway, that's my priority. Let's get on to the news coverage. Because we talked about how terrible yesterday was. We've been slagging off LBC already. Was the coverage of the vote, particularly with the government being found to be in contempt of Parliament, was the subsequent coverage by the BBC, by broadcast media, by print? I mean, print doesn't surprise anybody, but broadcast media in particular. Did that surprise you how bad it was?
Yeah, well, I suppose what Theresa May, I think, is hoping for is that people see her as trapped. So she's trying to do what's in the national interest, but MPs aren't giving her the capacity to do that. And I think the media, to a surprising degree, are going along with that. So, I mean, as you say, this is the first time that a government has lost 3 votes in the same day for 40 years, the first time that a government has been held in contempt. You'd expect people to be asking directly to Theresa May and all of her cabinet ministers, is Theresa May going to stand down? Can this government continue? And that's not what you're seeing. You're seeing people skirt around those issues and really allowing them to frame it in this narrative, which is, oh, what can happen next? Might you get it passed tomorrow? Da, 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 da. It's been made very technocratic instead of a make or break issue.
A political crisis.
Yeah, which it would be if Labour were in power.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be if Labour were in power and Jeremy Corbyn had done a Facebook comment on
it's true.
A post about
Go on.
I don't know whether or not what do you think is the most anodyne?
What's the most anodyne Corbyn crisis so far?
Yeah. I suppose the anorak.
I mean, no, but they were restricting. I mean, it must have been the dancing. People thought he was like boogieing
that was
at the last.
That was the second time we went to.
And the proof from dancing was photos.
The first one was that he didn't lean far enough. The second one was the dancing.
The jig.
And the most recent one was the anorak. Is Jeremy Corbyn going to resign?
Imagine that being your fucking life. These people have got degrees. They believe in themselves as sort of very, principled professionals. Wow. Anyway, so we've talked about those two things. I mean, I think we're of a mark. Here we go. Yeah, you can see the images here. He was apparently dancing. He was just walking, I think. Looks like he's actually having a power walk. You ever done power walking, Michael?
No. Have you?
No. It's one of my favourite events at the Olympics, though. So people walking. It's not really a sport, is it?
Very good for your gluteus maximus, probably.
Is it?
I imagine so. I mean, that's what it looks like.
Have you stopped working out recently, Michael?
Stopped?
Yeah.
That's a bit of an offensive question.
I'm not actually, no, because I can see the vein here on your biceps. I'm presuming you've started working out again. You did stop.
But you asked, have you stopped again?
Yeah, because you stopped recently.
Okay. Yeah. No, I've been going again. Yeah. The winter, you need something to keep your mood up.
Yeah, it's true. Sunbeds?
Occasionally.
Alex Ferguson used to call it vitamin D therapy.
Yeah, that's what it is.
People are like, what? And it was like he was just making his players go to the sunbeds.
Oh, he made his players go?
Yeah, in the middle of winter.
Good for him.
Yeah.
Always like that guy.
Yeah, nice guy. Should Labour come out for a second referendum? The eternal question.
Yeah, the eternal question. I mean, I think keep hedging their bets. If they ultimately have to come out for one. So I do think there is a danger for Labour now, because people who are hardcore Remain now see Brexit as potentially reversible. So because none of the outcomes seem likely, that almost makes stopping it become realistic, because there's no other more realistic option. So I think if they don't strongly go for a position where people can decide to reverse the result of the referendum, people will feel let down, or some people will feel let down.
More than, say, 6 months ago, right?
Yeah, exactly, more than 6 months ago. I think if they do go for a referendum, a line they could take is they say, we're going to remain because the government had tried, it failed, but our biggest priority in this campaign is to convince people who voted leave last time, who are our natural constituency, people who've been screwed over by neoliberalism, that if we remain, that is not the end of the political project to transform Britain. So basically, I think what they should do is go to Europe, go to the European Commission and say, can we implement all of these parts of the manifesto, and get it sort of publicly stated by Donald Tusk or whoever that says, like, yes, you could implement all of these things. And then they go around the country and say, look, we can guarantee to you that if we remain and we win the next general election, we will resolve many of the concerns you had. Unfortunately, Theresa May couldn't organise Brexit. This is the easiest way forward.
Yeah, they can present it as a Tory fuck-up, the mess they're having to clean up. I think they can do that actually be far easier than people recognise. I think you're right as well that a lot of the sort of the people campaigning for a second referendum would now be actively disappointed if Labour didn't do that. Whereas probably like a year ago, 6 months ago, they would have been just happy with a soft Brexit. Personally, I think that Labour absolutely should not back a second referendum.
Why?
It would end the possibility of Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister.
Go on.
Well, it just would. Just would. If people in London don't get that. People in major cities don't get that. People that are surrounded by like-minded people don't get that. But it just would. It just would. If you look at the electoral mathematics, UKIP got 121 second places in the 2015 general election. They got 4 million votes. It's a really significant vote.
Do you not think the Labour voting Brexit supporters are some of the least dogmatic Brexit supporters?
Yes. No, I don't think
to the extent that it's quite low down in their priority, so they might just say, oh, well, I kind of wanted to leave.
I agree with that.
They chose Remain, I'll vote for them anyway.
I agree with that.
Because of the rest of their programme.
I agree with that, but I do think that... Look, take away the economic arguments, so on and so forth. Obviously, they matter hugely. There was a referendum. Jeremy Corbyn addressed the public along with all the other sort of major political leaders of the time and said, this referendum will be binding. It will determine our future, whether or not we stay or leave the EU. And then he would have lied. That's how a critic will see it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I suppose
so why is he any different?
The dishonesty angle could really damage them.
Why is he any different to other politicians then if he goes back on his word? Because it is, look at the bigger context here. The exact same, look, we were meant to, the Lisbon Treaty was originally the European Constitution. We go, they don't want political union in the EU. Well, there was going to be a constitution. That's pretty political, right? It's going to be a constitution for the whole EU. The French people rejected it twice. The Irish rejected it, I think, twice. The Dutch, no, that was later on. The Dutch rejected it once, right? They didn't want a constitution. Ultimately, it had to be the Lisbon Treaty. Some stuff was dropped, but not much. It was broadly the same document. There is a history of repeatedly sending things back to the people until they give you the right answer.
But there's still overwhelming support for the EU in all of those countries that were given a second referendum. So, I mean, it hasn't created such a backlash that people...
France?
Well, France is still overwhelmingly pro-EU, yeah.
Do you not think that was... Okay, but there's clearly a massive discontent with elites. There's a massive discontent with mainstream politics. Emmanuel Macron is the president. What was his vote in the first round of the presidential election?
24, I think.
24, right? Marine Le Pen made the second place runoff. Okay, we don't need to over-dramatise that because her dad did the same thing more than a decade before. Jean-Luc Mélenchon's come out of nowhere. The mainstream Parti Socialiste is on the down. Now, I'm not saying that's just because of... No, I'm not just saying because of that. Clearly, it's not just because of, the Lisbon Treaty, the European Constitution. But clearly it feeds into a broader antipathy towards establishment politics. And the point of Jeremy Corbyn is that he rejects that. Right? He rejects that. And I do feel that he would lose quite a lot of magic if he was part of a second referendum.
And a campaign which he clearly didn't believe in as well.
Yeah.
Or felt very agnostic about, so he'd have to be going around arguing for a Remain vote and people would see it as kind of fake. Because I think a lot of people deep in their heart think he is a Brexiteer and they don't really mind because they think at least he's stuck to his guns, which is he's someone who's skeptical about Europe, like many people, and he's never pretended not to be. You're right. I mean, that could be a risk if it makes him seem dishonest. more than people being so annoyed that we remained and they wanted to leave that they can't imagine voting for the Labour Party, because I do think that Labour voters who voted leave are less dogmatic about it.
But it's not.
Because if you were so committed to Brexit that it was your number one priority, you wouldn't have been
It's
voting
not.
Labour
It's
for
not about
ages.
Brexit. It's about the principle of respecting the democratic wishes of the people. And people go, "Oh well, they were fucking wrong." I'm not talking about that. You might think that's nonsense. I'm talking about from the perspective of millions of voters generally. Already, look, this is the thing. When you leave London, or when you leave these major sort of cities and you go to places, well, who was I talking to? I was talking to somebody, I can't remember, just the off-the-cuff conversation in the Southwest when I did BBC Any Questions. And the guy said, I'm not voting for Labour, they're all the same. They don't think that Corbyn's this like unhinged wacko. They still think that Labour is very much a part of the establishment that doesn't care about them, doesn't listen to them. And I just think getting involved in that campaign would be the last thing you want to do if you want to dismantle that notion. And I think that's why we're involved in the Labour Party, because we do want to say, look, this is an absolutely new kind of politics. No, it's not the kind of gentler politics, or we're all going to be nice to each other on Twitter. It's about empowering, listening to, helping ordinary people. And that's not a platitude. It means, like you were saying, investing significant amounts of money into local economies, moving away from a London-centric economy, giving people the capacities to build their own lives.
If there were a general election, what should Labour's Brexit policy be? Because I suppose that's one thing that might incline Theresa May to call one, because she thinks that, it's going to be a difficult election for her. But last time Labour did quite well because they avoided the Brexit question, and this time that's going to be harder to do if this general election takes place two months before Article 50 runs out, which is possible.
That's the point, yeah. If there's a general election after Article 50 is done, then it's a lot easier for them. If it's before, which is why you suspect Theresa May might try and do it. I mean,
calls their bluff almost.
Yeah, I think that's the last card she's got. Ultimately, Labour are almost as divided on this issue as the Tories. It's just they're not in power. So, but then she's obviously very risk averse. In terms of what Labour should put in their manifesto, I'll say this. If Labour did want to pursue a second referendum, which I think is a very bad idea, it would make more sense to put it in a manifesto, get a mandate for it, and then say, well, look, you can say the last result is binding. We won the most votes to be the largest party in Parliament on the basis of offering a second referendum. That also has a democratic mandate. That's actually a really good argument, okay? I don't necessarily agree with it in terms of expediency and so on.
The general election would then become the second referendum.
Effectively, which is what the Tories tried to do last time, and I personally doubt whether Labour would win that general election with that promise. What do you think?
I think it's incredibly difficult. I do think that it's kind of easier for Labour if the next general election comes after Article 50 has run out and we have left the European Union. If it does happen beforehand, I think if it does happen beforehand and Labour didn't offer a second referendum, there would be a split in the PLP, and that could take a significant amount of votes. Because even though I think there's only 5 to 10% of the population who are so passionate about Remain that they value it higher than getting the Tories out, presuming these are Labour voters anyway, that could take enough people with them to cause Labour real damage in marginal seats. Places like Canterbury, if there's a breakaway party, then Labour loses Canterbury. And if you lose Canterbury, it's difficult to win a majority, right? Because I don't think we're going to make up those seats in traditional heartland places that voted Brexit because we don't back a second referendum, because we'll still seem like the Remain party. So I think strategically it could make sense to back a second referendum in that general election, just in terms of what's the easiest way to keep the biggest coalition with you as possible, but then direct all of your campaign. So as soon as they say they're going to do a second referendum, that means all your Liberal voters are in the bag, and then what you have to do is campaign. And it also means there's not much space for a breakaway party. Then you put all your energy into campaigning in Leave areas on the platform of increasing economic investment and hope for the best. All options are quite bad, but I think that probably is the least bad ones in terms of winning the maximum number of seats in Westminster.
Okay, next question. Is now the moment to make a left case against the European Union?
Why not, I suppose? It depends who. Should Jeremy Corbyn come out?
Should the left? The left famously failed to make a case for Lexit in 2016, people going, "Oh, Lexit, that's nonsense." Well, okay, you might think it was nonsense. So was this ultra hard right Brexit we were apparently going to get, which was inevitable. That hasn't materialised either. So I suppose the reason why I say that is because, well, if there is to be a second referendum, even if you were a Remainer, is it not important that we resuscitate a tradition of left Euroscepticism? Because it feels like the right has grabbed this issue, and because the left isn't contesting it, they've just left the field. They're not even playing ball. And there are a lot of people that have, for a range of reasons, don't like the EU. Some legitimate, some not. And the left isn't engaging with a lot of that because there isn't this tradition of left Euroscepticism, which there was 40 years ago. Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn, etc. So that's why I say that. Is it important almost to defang some of these arguments from the right that we have a left Eurosceptic tradition in this country, even if you are a Remainer, even if you don't want Britain to actually leave the EU?
Well, the problem is that, so if you're looking at this in terms of a potential referendum campaign and how should the left position itself, I mean, what's going to be on the ballot is Remain, Theresa May's deal, or potentially no deal. So then as the left, if you've got an anti-EU argument, you'd have to campaign for no deal because Theresa May's deal puts the left in a worse position because basically we're subject to all the state aid rules that we would be subject to inside the EU, but because we're outside of the decision-making processes, we have less bargaining power if we do want to break those rules. So if we're inside the EU and we break state aid rules, it's kind of harder for them to punish us because we have a lot of leverage because we're one of the big players in the EU. If we go outside of it and we break the state aid rules, they can just say, look, we're withdrawing all these trading relationships that we have with you, and then that will damage our economy. There's not much we can do to them. So in terms of realpolitik, yeah, the left would either have to campaign for no deal or Remain. I mean, you could campaign for no deal in a sort of accelerationist argument. So you say, we've made the principled argument against the EU. Obviously, there's not going to be time for the government to organise an ordered no deal Brexit. It's going to be fairly disordered. It's going to have some economic hardship with it, but you could sort of take the long-term view and you say, no, taking the long view, it's worth it for Britain to have 2 years of economic pain to be able to, in the future, move towards an economy liberated from the neoliberal strictures of the European Union. I don't find that argument particularly convincing. But I mean, it's possible. But I mean, that's the question. Should the left campaign for no deal or should the left campaign for Remain? Or if we have a Labour government...
They clearly can't campaign for no deal, right? I mean, that's just madness. Well,
then they have to campaign for Remain. They're the only options that would be on the ballot paper.
No, but... Okay,
I mean, if there's a Labour government and this is what Paul Mason wants, right? So there's a Labour government, they negotiate a soft Brexit deal and then put it out to a referendum. I mean, I think it'd be quite hard to make a left case for that because Labour's deal would be really soft.
Yeah. But do you not think... So the left sort of Remain campaign, which has emerged in the last 2 years, which is impressive. Obviously, a lot of the People's Vote stuff is mostly ex-Lib Dems and Tories, but there are still, you could see this from the Labour Party conference. And the argument they make is Remain and reform. And whatever you think about leaving or remaining, there is no way the EU is going to be reformed. It's not happening. It's literally not going to happen. Right? And we can rehearse maybe in the questions afterwards. People can say, well, why do you think that? I just think for a variety of reasons, maybe in the off chance of a German leftist government coming to power, which wants to undermine the interests of its own manufacturing exporters for no reason particularly, yes, then maybe it could be reformed. Or maybe the Visegrad states from Central and Eastern Europe, if they all of a sudden didn't care, they're happy to buy into this project, which makes Germany the regional hegemon, if it means they have protection from Russia. Or France, it's happy to buy in. They all have all these competing interests. France is happy to buy into this project because it gives them a sense of inflated sort of global profile. And it also restrains German interests within the continent. So all these different countries have different interests. Italy less so, which is why I think Italy may leave the Eurozone. So that's partly why I don't think we'll ever have major left-wing reform of the EU. So then the question has to be, if the left wants us to remain in the EU, but admits it can't be reformed, I mean, what the fuck does that mean? It's a meaningless argument, surely.
Well, it depends. So I find the argument that we're going to democratise the EU very unconvincing. I don't think there is a European demos. So I think if you pretend that you have made those institutions in Brussels more democratic, probably what you'll be masking is fairly undemocratic rule. I just can't see European law having democratic legitimacy in the sense that there's a direct link between the electorate and the European Parliament. I think the EU is always going to be a negotiation between the political leaders of sovereign nation states. But the way in which there could be reform is if you have enough leaders of European nation states who are willing to say, actually, we should bend that rule. So, I mean, the left argument is going to be, do we want to do something in our manifesto that breaks the state aid rules? Because there are advantages of being in the EU. I mean, if we left the EU, the trade deals we would be offered wouldn't necessarily be on particularly helpful terms for us.
I agree with that. I agree with all that.
So you want to stay in the customs union anyway. But in terms of... So what I'm saying is I don't know if the EU needs to be reformed as such. I think the issue is if in the powerful states you can create enough leverage so that the rules we don't like can be basically broken, then that's the best we can hope for.
Libertarian socialist future. Italy leaving the Eurozone, as if that will be allowed to happen. Well, they're the fourth largest bond market in the world, so they've got a lot more leverage than the Greeks. I mean, Kostas Lapavitsa said this is hugely interesting. When people are watching this and they're defending the European Union, remember this. George Papandreou, the Greek Prime Minister, I think till 2011, was removed effectively in a soft coup. He was replaced by a guy called Luka Papademos. He wants to put the question, really, of Greece's membership of the Eurozone, all these things, to a potential referendum, right? If Greece had done that in 2011, if Greece had left the Eurozone in 2011, it would have destroyed the entire Eurozone. So that could not be allowed, if it had effectively the Oki vote, even just rejecting a bailout deal. In 2011, the Eurozone did not have the insulation and the firewalls to stop that becoming a major systemic crisis. By 2015, they do. Which is why when, Tsipras and Varoufakis stood up, they don't give a fuck. Wolfgang Schäuble was even happy for the Greeks to leave the Eurozone. He didn't really think it was going to be a net loss, ultimately. Them leaving solved as many problems as it created. That wasn't the case in 2011, right? So, I mean, when you're dealing with this kind of entity, they removed the democratic government in 2011. It was also an internal coup by the Greek establishment in hoc with the Europeans, right? You have a very similar thing in 2011 in Italy to get rid of Berlusconi. They replaced him with Mario Monti. I mean, we're dealing with something which is so profoundly undemocratic here. So, okay, do you really think, with all these dynamics at work, I mean, they created a run on the banks during the Oki vote to try and get the Greek electorate to vote one way and not the other? Do you really think they're that interested in democratising the European Union? And people say, oh, well, we can, give more powers to the European Parliament. No, the one reform I want of the EU is to scrap the European Parliament. It makes no sense at all. If you're going to have a democratic EU, I agree with you. The Council of Ministers, you have domestic governments, that should be the democratic. Who the fuck are these? Who is my MEP? What do they do? What do they stand for? I don't know. You're at least with party, but this is a great point by Kostas Lapavitsa. We did a great interview with him. It's on YouTube. It's true. In America, you know what the Democrats stand for, the Republicans or the Parti Socialiste in France, whatever. You might think they're bullshit values, but they know what they are. What does the European People's Party in the European Parliament stand for? It's not an actual political party. It's a coalition of 15 disparate parties. So how is that a step towards democratising the European Union? I mean, what do you think?
No, I think the idea of democratising the EU is unrealistic. I mean, I think it's only ever going to be a mirage. So yeah, I think what we should see the EU as is a negotiation between democratic sovereign nation states.
Pat H has said Berlusconi was replaced by the Italian people. In case you didn't notice, they voted in Italy. Well, you might want to look as to how Mario Monti became the Prime Minister in 2011. As with Luka Papademos the same year in Greece, he wasn't voted in. He was chosen by unelected technocrats. I'm not making this up. Anyway, sorry, Michael. No, go on. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I made my point. We're not going to democratise the EU, but potentially, if you get some strong leftist states in place, then I mean, the EU rules have always been broken. I mean, yeah, I suppose there's two issues. Can you reform it so that nation states have slightly more freedom to adopt state aid policies? The Eurozone's a completely different issue. So, in terms of whether the Eurozone could be reformed, I mean, that's completely...
The Eurozone's fucked.
That's a different conversation.
The Eurozone's
and it's fucked.
Yeah, and it's totally
But in terms of, can we do what a leftist would want to do Within the EU, probably, I think.
But here's the thing: people are tying themselves, and I agree with you. The eurozone is not the EU, right? There is an argument to stay in the EU. There's no argument whatsoever to stay in the eurozone for the countries that are in it, particularly in the southern periphery. But is the single market, which is the thing that apparently, even if we were just in the customs union, that's the thing, right? Is the customs union sustainable if there was to be an end of the eurozone, single monetary union? EMU, it's called EMU, European Monetary Union. I mean, actually, quite a few people think it probably wouldn't exist anymore. There would be a really big, again, systemic crisis just for the idea of the single market without the single currency. And that's not to say that the single currency had to happen. I agree with Kostas on this. It didn't have to happen. It was overreach. You could have had the single market, and it probably would have lasted a very long time with very few crises like the ones we've seen over the last several years without the eurozone. However, now that they've pursued that, it makes the sustainability of the single market very, very, very difficult in regards to internal migration and labour flows, in regards to what it does for the competitiveness in domestic industries in certain places. I mean, particularly, I think, for France and Italy. These are historically two of the largest 10 economies, two of the largest 7 economies, G7, in the world. Very large manufacturers. Clearly a very strong, profound sense of national identity historically. You've had Pétain in France, you had de Gaulle, obviously not a fascist or a collaborator, but an ultra-nationalist. You had Mussolini in Italy. And it really feels to me like as long as these two countries are tied up in this club, those politics inevitably will return, particularly into these two countries. And I just feel like that has to be part of the broader conversation about what kind of club we're joining, what we're trying to legitimise as leftists.
I mean, because
Mélenchon wants to break with the eurozone, right? So if we're saying Corbyn supporters would be supportive of Mélenchon candidacy in 3 years' time.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the eurozone. We're talking about. So I think there's a reasonable amount of sovereignty that you might want to pool. We're gonna live in an international system. So, and within an international system, countries are going to have to follow some rules so that they can continue trading with the other countries.
Absolutely.
Right. There's going to be negotiated agreements between states,
Absolutely.
Which means that if you break those agreements, there's going to be some consequences, which is the same as the EU, right? We can leave at any point, but if we decide to leave unilaterally at any point, there will be some consequences. It's the same with any international negotiation. Have we pulled too much sovereignty in the EU? I think probably. I mean, it's questionable. Has Greece pulled too much sovereignty in terms of joining the euro? Absolutely. Have we pulled too much sovereignty by joining the EU? Probably not. And I don't think that by remaining members of the EU, we're displaying a lack of solidarity with countries who want to also remain in the EU but leave the eurozone.
No, because people make the argument for the single market. The single currency is an outgrowth of the single market. The currency is the completion of the 4 freedoms, trying to create as integrated an economic bloc as possible. Clearly, there's not going to be.
Well, it's to stop competitive devaluations. So it's the idea that if you don't have any tariffs up against your neighbours, what you don't want is them to devalue their currency just to get a competitive advantage over you.
It's the fullest extension of it. And my point is, now that it's happened, the single market, in the event of the end of the eurozone, or I don't think the eurozone will end, I just think some countries will leave it. It probably will work for Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium. That would work. It'd be a very powerful currency. They have very different interests to Eastern Central Europe and Southern Europe. That's clearly the club that we're buying into, though. So when people say, well, we want to stay in the single market, don't we? The conversation around what the end of the euro might look like has to be there. Because right now, we're all talking about Britain. We're all talking about how we should stay in the EU, how the right has been fucking stupid. They have been. But it's suspended a very important conversation about a more, there is a systemic crisis across Europe because of the eurozone, because of the economic models. And it just feels like this whole conversation is blind to that. The presumption that if we stay in the single market, as if it's just going to stay around inevitably anyway, when actually, other countries could be leaving the single market quite soon.
I think you could have a single market without the euro. I mean, what happened with the exchange rate mechanism is...
Which we left
because we couldn't remain within it. I mean, what that did is it kept a certain degree of stability between the currencies, but also if you had to fall out for whatever reason, so if Greece had to fall out and had to devalue, if they were within the exchange rate mechanism instead of within the euro, so they still printed their own drachma, but if they devalued to too great a degree, they lost some access to the single market or to the rest of the single market, they would have gone for that. It would have been fine. The problem is that they've given up the rights to print their own cash. So I think an idea where we were within some sort of exchange rate mechanism, European exchange rate mechanism, that you could fall out of in times of emergency. I mean, that seems like quite a good compromise. I don't see why
The point is,
the future
Michael,
of the single market is tied to the survival
but
of
this
the
is
euro.
but this is what some people are saying.
Who?
Costas is one. Martin Wolf is another.
Saying what?
The single market, because now there's been so much of an architecture built around around EMU, European Monetary Union, in the advent of the eurozone collapsing. You don't have to be dramatic. Several members leaving, it facing a political crisis. The single market itself would face severe problems. Another issue is take immigration. Sarkozy was talking about the suspension, and Berlusconi talking about the suspension of Schengen, free movement of people. So the idea that, the single market is this thing, this static thing, which is going to be here regardless. No, there are going to be people arguing for capital controls in the EU over the next 10 years, believe me, coming from the left, and maybe the right. There's going to be people arguing for controls on immigration, There's going to be people arguing for all of these things. So the idea that, like I say, the single market is just this thing.
Yeah, but isn't that... So Schengen was suspended, right?
Briefly, yeah.
So that's an example of how the single market isn't particularly monolithic. If there's a particular demand that is felt so strongly and expressed so strongly...
It was like for a day or something, wasn't it? It wasn't.
Was it only for a day?
It was for like 2 days.
Let's look it up. You keep talking while I Google that.
Look, if you're watching this and you're thinking, these guys, they're chatting shit, but I'm enjoying it, go to support.novaramedia.com, help us build a new media for different politics. If there is a general election, this is the kind of content we want to be putting out every night. Interviews with top people, top thinkers, top politicians, journalists. If you go through our YouTube channel, you can see the kind of people we talk to. We just spoke to Paul Lewis 2 days ago on Monday night. Great, outstanding. I very much admire him, actually. Journalist at The Guardian. We talked about populism. For more of that stuff, yes, follow us on Twitter. Yes, follow us on Facebook. But it would really mean so much to us if you go to support.novaramedia.com, make a one-off payment or a subscription, and this can just keep on growing. We had an amazing 2018. If we have a 2019, Michael, like last year, I mean, we're going to be impressive.
I want an election just for that.
Also, a Labour government would be nice.
It's true. Imagine election sesh when Labour have won the fucking election. That'd
We'll
be
hire
amazing.
the O2, right? That's the plan.
Schengen.
Yep.
It wasn't suspended for a couple of days. A temporary suspension of the Schengen rules has been in place in some Schengen countries for more than 3 years, although the limit is 2. So
what countries? You're going to say like Latvia or something? What countries?
No, but I mean, the weaker the country...
There was a suspension. No, but there was a suspension for like 2 days by Sarkozy.
Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, Norway and Sweden have had internal border checks in place due to exceptional circumstances since 2015, although the current limit is 2 years. So what that's telling you is, one, that the rules allow some flexibility. Two, the rules can just be completely broken if powerful states want to break them.
Yeah.
So given that we're in a powerful state, if we want to break the rules, we can just break the rules.
But that's not Remain and Reform, is it?
I'm not for Remain and Reform.
No, but I'm just saying to you, like, I started this by saying the left part of the sort of Remain camp, not the Liberals, are saying we need to Remain and Reform, and the EU can be a tool for leftist causes and so on and so forth. Where actually the sensible argument is no, we can stay in, and it's very much a realpolitik argument, which I don't agree with in its entirety. I agree with it far more than the Remain and Reform argument. But it's a difficult thing to sell to the public, isn't it?
No. I mean, that's been the basis of Britain's membership of the EU from the beginning, is the idea that we give up some sovereignty for our own national self-interest, and ultimately our ability to adopt the kind of economic policies we want to will be subject to us using the weight of our national economy and political standing to get opt-outs, to allow ourselves to do what we want. And it's quite successful. I mean, the opt-outs were generally for things that I would have preferred to have opted in for. I mean, Britain has been a very reactionary force in the European Union. But in terms of have we been able to use the clout of Britain to protect our sovereignty, it's gone okay. I mean, I think one of the reasons people were so anti-European in Britain is because no one made the argument for it, and people associate it with neoliberalism, and people associate it with migration, and no one had ever made the argument for migration. So, I mean, there are some historical reasons why people are opposed to it, but I think an argument that's based on Britain can still keep enough sovereignty, and this is kind of in our self-interest, is the only one that's going to win, not some sort of like flowery argument about European demos, which I don't think will ever exist. Too many languages.
That's true. True. Somebody's saying the Morning Star is a co-op. I'm sure Navarra can do it too. Look, if Moscow had given us millions of dollars worth of gold 30 years ago, I mean, yeah, great. But until then, difficult to compare to the Morning Star. Also, this is free, whereas you pay for a newspaper. We should actually talk about this at some point about mutuals and co-ops. We did a radio show about the co-op bank. Do you remember when it collapsed a few years ago?
Oh no, I haven't heard that one.
Have you not heard it?
No.
And the CEO, do you remember the guy? It was not CEO. He was like the director or whatever it was. What was his name? He was like taking drugs with sex workers. He's complete wrong on.
That was the director of Co-op.
The co-op bank isn't a cooperative, okay? Because it uses the same clearing banks as the big six. It's not a cooperative. Okay, just let you know.
They should have to change the name, really, shouldn't they?
Yeah, it's kind of false advertising, isn't it?
100%.
It was part of the cooperative group, which is, you know, actually even that's quite fucking dodgy to be honest. But anyway, Paul Flowers, yeah, complete wrong one. All right, we have one more question left, Michael. I think you've been magnificent tonight.
Thanks, man. You got me in at the last minute, I have to say.
Well, yeah, no, actually, because just to say, James Butler, who was advertised to come on this evening, and sort of Navarra constitutional guru, had a tummy upset. Ate some crab last night.
Oh, really? Oh, that's very James Butler, isn't it?
So,
I think you should avoid seafood.
I think
it's an unnecessary risk.
You know, I thought it was very shellfish of him.
Ooh. That's when we need a sound effect of sort of canned laughter.
Somebody said I thought he was vegetarian. Well, so did I.
Oh, so did I.
No, he does eat fish sometimes. Let's go to some questions, 5 minutes, and then let's wrap up.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, this was fun. Questions, please, guys. And for people who are listening to this as a podcast, we will read the questions before we answer them.
All right. Ho, 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 ho. Come on, put a question mark on it. Should an incoming Labour government guarantee the existing rights of EU citizens?
Existing EU citizens in the country?
In the country,
Absolutely,
yeah.
obviously.
I mean, that's already been guaranteed, though, I think.
Give them a British passport, I don't care.
In terms of should they say we will continue, we are politically committed to freedom of movement, I think that would probably be premature.
Anybody who's here obviously should have the right to permanent rights to remain. And this is the thing, and I think people need to think about this very clearly, and sort of the ultra remain lot were doing this. They're saying, we want to vote for Labour, we'd vote for Lib Dems. Think very clearly about this. There are millions of EU nationals here. Labour would make sure these people stay here permanently. The Tories, less likely. This is serious stuff. I mean, Theresa May actually said recently she would, but, you know, it was on the table for a long time that she wouldn't.
Gary McQuiggan says, any fun parties this week? Michael, well, funny you say that, Gary, because Navarra Media's Christmas party is coming up this Friday. It's at the Rocksteady. It costs £10, but it all goes into growing our organisation. They're always very good. I'm looking forward to it, so hopefully see you all there.
Yeah, it's going to be great this Friday. And they have Patron Tequila, coffee flavour, delicious. Best alcohol money can buy. They also have Rare Nephew rum. It was the 75-80% prof rum, which is fantastic. Great question here from Juliet Jakes. It's been widely said that a second referendum would revive the far right. Very pertinent question in regards to what's going on Sunday. Do you think it will? And is this a reason not to do it? Would a second referendum revive the far right?
Yeah, probably would. I mean, it's definitely an opportunity for them, isn't it? It's an ability to mobilise people to have a narrative of betrayal. And I think that should definitely be taken into account. I think the extent to which the far right could increase their support on that basis is potentially overstated. But I suppose, I mean, you'd probably have UKIP back up to 15-20%, I suppose. Although if the Conservatives remain the Brexit party, then they can maybe keep absorbing that vote. I mean, it's an opportunity for them, but I mean, they're going to have many opportunities, aren't they? I'd say that's probably the main reason to not have a second referendum, is that it gives a fantastic opportunity to the far right. But potentially the reasons to have it outweigh that.
Okay, I've got a great question here, actually. What is your opinion on the Clinton and Angela Nagel recent interventions on immigration? Kind of dovetails what you just said, right? So Hillary Clinton was reported in The Guardian as saying that ultimately to defang the far right, the left has to be tougher on this stuff. Angela Nagel, these are two separate people saying two different things, wrote a piece about the left case for borders. This is actually, I'm really happy we're going to talk about this because it's really important.
I've only read the first half of the Angela Nagel piece, and I saw her on Who's the most right-wing host on Fox News? Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson, yeah.
So yeah, I think Angela Nagel has done something which is quite a common move for commentators who start out left-wing. They identify that there are some sort of unhelpful dogmas on the left, and they point that out, and that makes them quite successful within the left, because sometimes it's brave to say what are the dogmas that are taboo to point out, but they're holding the left back. I'm not in favour of no borders, for example. And I think the fact that she said this is a bit of a weird ultra-leftist thing that's become taboo to say on the left was a valuable thing to do. I think what she then did is adopted the position of the alt-right and the far-right by saying these taboos that the left have, these are civilizational problems. So the problem with Angela Nagel is that she suggests that the mainstream left, and even that the Democratic Party, even that the American political establishment support open borders. So she's completely overstating what is current policy, what are current positions of the left, to make herself seem like the ultimately sensible person. And I think what she's not doing is being realistic about how small support is for complete open borders. She's making quite a banal point, which is that borders aren't necessarily racist. That's within the democratic right of a sovereign nation to control their borders. I mean, Hillary Clinton went one step further, I think. So I think you definitely make the argument that, yeah, it's within a democratic nation state's right to have controls on their borders, but we have international obligations to accept refugees. I think that's
Are borders racist?
I don't think borders are racist. I think borders can be operated in a racist way. I think historically probably most borders are.
But how can you have an anti-racist border?
I don't think you can have an anti-racist border. I think you can have a non-racist border. So, I mean, if you have a sovereign nation that decides...
I love this guy. Go on, yeah.
That you have a sovereign nation that decides it wants to have borders, you know, I think that's within the rights of a democratic people in a polity. And so long as the restrictions on who gets to come in and who doesn't get to come in have no relation to race or ethnicity or religion.
Or a range of other things.
A range of other things. If you can show that they're not discriminatory, that this is just...
But they would be discriminatory, wouldn't they?
Well, it'd be
you might say people that we need graduates or we need nurses, etc. That would be
discriminatory. Would it be discriminatory in terms of protected characteristics? I mean, if you're talking about are they racist, then they'd have to not be discriminatory based on race or ethnicity.
Yeah.
And then I think you'd have a non-racist border.
But for instance, we at the moment give tier 1 visas to multimillionaires.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly that's privileging a certain group of people over others in terms of being...
So we have pro-rich borders. It's very different to a racist border, isn't it?
I'm not saying they're the same thing, Michael. Yeah. I'm just saying...
I mean, maybe we shouldn't have pro-rich borders, but what I'm saying is
that wouldn't be a protected characteristic either. I would also submit that it's probably not a good thing.
To have what? A pro-rich border?
Yeah, having cheap visas or passport access for wealthier people. Not cheap. Plausible, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you could potentially do the opposite, right? So the best thing about migration for, like, development, to try and create a world where economies are at a similar level of wealth, is remittances. I suppose the wealthy are the least likely to bother with remittances because they are sort of international class. What you want is people who come over, send money back to their families, and that means that countries elsewhere in the world can get richer. I mean, that's what we want ultimately. That's why I don't think that there's a sort of almost contrarian argument that Angela Nagel makes, actually, without any nuance at all, where she's sort of saying open borders is a reactionary policy because it creates brain drain in the global south, but she ignores remittances because it's not helpful to her argument, and so she ends up making...
Also, remittances are kind of overstated as a thing.
No,
they're huge for several countries. Now, I know the global volume is quite impressive, but it goes overwhelmingly to like 4 or 5 countries, like the Philippines, and I can't remember where.
Yeah, but it's also the countries where people migrate. So if you're saying the argument is that there's a brain drain,
yeah,
it's precisely those countries where you'd say, oh, there was a brain drain from those countries that the remittances are going back there. So I mean, in terms of, I think it's a disgrace that Britain...
Is that true? I mean, the Philippines is one of the biggest recipients of remittances, and that's not because it's like doctors and nurses. It tends to be like sort of lower income service work, cleaners, au pairs, nannies, gardeners.
No, exactly. Yeah, I don't think it should be doctors.
That's not brain drain, is it? You're saying that like Iran has huge brain drain, doesn't have massive remittances.
Oh, because we only take the doctors.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a bad policy. So, I mean, I think it's a complete disgrace that we are, as a country, milking other people's poorer countries' training systems for doctors and nurses.
And this is a liberal argument.
But that's not an argument for
This is a liberal argument. You get the Remain people, they go, oh, the NHS, it's true. The NHS needs immigrants. Without them, it wouldn't last 10 minutes. Yeah, that's fucking terrible. That's fucking terrible. The taxpayer of these poorer countries are paying for the education of health professionals to subsidise. It's an effective subsidy by the Global South of our NHS. And you're sort of dressing up as progressive.
Yeah, but the problem with Angela Nagel is that she doesn't just make that point. She tries to use that as an example why we should have closed borders, or why we should, she mixes all the possible arguments for why we should have closed borders. She sort of invokes the American trade unionists who try and keep the Chinese out in the early 20th century, as if that's sort of like a woke working class policy, not sort of one of the darker moments of the American labour movement. Because, if you want a solidaristic border policy, then precisely who you'd be promoting to come is people who are sort of like middle skill level, who can send back quite a lot of remittances. And also, as a sovereign nation, you're probably only going to let people in either if they are entitled to refugee status or are going to contribute something to the economy that your economy needs. But I don't think that should be highly skilled doctors. We should be training so many highly skilled doctors that we're exporting them to the rest of the world, not bringing them here and draining poorer countries' education systems and poorer countries' health services. Do you think borders are racist, Aaron?
No, well, I think you've sort of persuaded me on this. Somebody said I'm with Marx in the comments, and they said workers the world unite. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because that's in the Communist Manifesto. He actually talks about in each nation state the working class becoming the ruling class. So he very much is situating that within an ontology of the nation state, often taken out of context. Here we go. Finally, they labour everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. So it's very much about workers of the world unite, internationalism, but it's still very much within the ontology of the nation state, which I think is often lost when people talk about
That's the point. Internationalism doesn't imply you collapse nation states.
Yeah.
I think the only plausible unit for democracy is something about the size of a nation state. I can't really imagine global democracy. I don't think there's a global demos.
No, I totally
So
agree
I think what you're going to have to, what we're aiming for is nation states that act in a solidaristic internationalist manner, whilst
I've always said that. I've always said that the only repository for mass democracy we've ever seen in the history of humanity has been the nation state. Not for very long, not in all that many places, but quite important. So you didn't like the Angela Nagel piece then?
No.
Got a lot of hate, didn't it?
Yeah, no, I think, to be honest, as I say, I think she's making some quite crude arguments. I also thought it was a complete disgrace that she went on Tucker Carlson to say. One thing I say is that I don't think we should no platform Angela Nagel. I'd quite like to get her on the show.
I think great.
In fact, there's an open invite. She's just not often in London. But I think going on Tucker Carlson when in the background there were images of people trying to cross the border from Mexico. These are asylum seekers, people who are claiming asylum. They might not necessarily get it. Potentially they are economic migrants, and then America has a sovereign right to decide.
It's their right to apply for it,
But it's their right to apply to it. And Angela Nagel is talking to Tucker Carlson, making the argument about how migration suppresses wages. And to go on Fox News when you've got asylum seekers in the background and talking about how migration suppresses wages, I think that is outrageous and unacceptable, because what you always have to say is that an absolute and unconditional right that people have is for asylum if they are being politically persecuted. And she didn't make that point at all. So I thought it was pretty bad. And I think also she's now becoming that voice where it's sort of like, obviously right wingers love to have someone who's notionally left wing agree with them, which is kind of what she does now.
I think she's got a thing where, we'll wrap up in a sec. I think she's got a thing where she has like the sunk cost fallacy. Like, she's sunk a lot of social capital into a certain set of arguments and to a certain identity, and like, you don't really turn around ship when you've done that.
I think it's a sign of, well, it's a bit mean, but
don't be mean, Mike. We want to get her on the show.
I suppose intellectual weakness in a way. Or maybe it's not inherent intellectual weakness, but I think the idea of taking what is a marginal but silly opinion in her ideas, in her idea, and I think I often agree with her in terms of what she thinks is a bit. There's many aspects I disagree with her on, but some of them, So there's the thing about cry bullying, like people trying to drive people out of the left if they've said the wrong thing.
Yeah, definitely exists, and it's ridiculous.
certain what I think are taboos among the left, but which will lock us out of power forever because they're not particularly convincing, which is sort of like how no borders is a moral absolute. There's sort of these elements of the left which were taboo to point out, which she was brave enough to point out, and I think that made her book valuable. But what she does is make that seem like, civilizational threats, and that's incredibly lazy. It's straw manning. Her whole career is now a straw man, basically.
Yeah. Well, so it's a bit like the LBC stuff we were talking about earlier on, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
You're talking about people that really don't reflect a large swathe of society. Most people really don't give a fuck, kind of live and let live, whatever. You know, it's difficult to sort of begin to build a normative theory of politics on that. It's kind of actually kind of redundant. I think we're going to call it quits. People are talking about the Kurds, and look, the Kurdish revolution has. What do you mean? I mean, give us a functioning example of a successful revolution that transcended the nation state. Please. We're empiricists, right?
You want an empirical example of a democratic revolution that transcended the nation state? Yeah, I mean, by definition, there isn't one, right?
Well, not by definition. I mean, somebody might say the USSR. You know, in a sense, the Internationale was the national anthem. Transcended, you know, it went into a number of countries, but I mean, the counter argument is because it was just parasitizing the former Russian Empire, right? It was just another imperial state.
I mean, they had borders, right?
They had borders. Aaron, Spain in 1936, but this is like for 3 months. I mean, it's not it's great. I love Spain in 1936. Don't get me wrong, but it's not, it's not the same. I thought you put it well when you said. Because I think obviously borders are and they obviously emerge in a context of a hierarchy of race. The modern border regime obviously does, but then you said borders aren't racist, but border regimes can be,
and generally are. But I think the argument that borders generally are racist and we need to make them less racist is a very strong one, which people will find convincing. I think the argument that borders are necessarily racist is not a strong one, and people won't find that convincing.
I think it's a really good argument.
Thanks.
I think you've done it again.
Aaron.
I think you've done it again.
You wasted so much time asking me about parliamentary arithmetic and Brexit.
No, I think you've done it
I was
again.
blagging
You
on
did.
those
You
ones.
did this on prison abolitionism as well. What's your line on that?
Oh no, I'm gonna get boycotted now. Prison abolition, ridiculous.
Oh,
That's my position on
now
it.
we're what do they call them? The Strasserites.
Yeah. No, but I suppose the difference between say like me and Angela Nagel is I think prison abolition is a bit ridiculous, but I don't think that the fact that some people on the left are in favour of prison abolition is some massive issue that I'm now going to go on mainstream TV talking about how there's so many people on the left who are completely obsessed with no borders and prison abolition, because I do think that for obvious reasons it's marginal because it's not particularly convincing. But
your argument against sort of prison abolition is that I kind of agree. You would be able to reduce the prison population in modern day Britain, I think, by like 95%.
When we talked about it's going from first principles, isn't it?
Yeah. Why say prison abolition? Why call it that?
Yeah. If what you're doing is reform, then it's. I mean, another thing that people do with both no borders and abolition is they say we're going to do a reformist policy which is on the road to prison abolition or on the road to the abolition of borders. But for me, that's just a cop-out that makes you less convincing as a person. Because in any society I can imagine, we're going to have rules, right? There's going to be some set of rules so that you know how you're supposed to engage with each other, so that there's some certainty about what people can do and what people cannot do. You're also going to have some people whose job is law enforcement, because otherwise, I mean, what you really don't want, what's going to be really totalitarian is if everyone's a cop. So people say like, we could get rid of the cops and we just have sort of like non-hierarchical community policing. But to me that sounds a lot like you're going to get kangaroo courts. I mean, I kind of like to know who's the cop and who's not the cop.
Yeah.
I think having some sort of judicial process, which is nominally at least based on interpreting those rules instead of sort of making holistic judgments about people, is probably safer than the other option. I mean, I'd hate the idea of living in a society where we had these weird anarchist kangaroo courts. When I've seen them function, they've been horrific. So for that to be on
only under capitalism,
for that to be on a statewide level would be awful. So I mean, I think we can have 10% of the people in prison who are currently in prison, and I think we can make prisons a lot nicer. We can invest a lot more money so that they are places where you can learn, grow as a person. I mean, there'll be some people who are psychopaths and always will be psychopaths, and I mean, whatever society we live in, that's probably going to be the case.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can have a much more humanitarian system of justice, prisons, policing. But I think abolishing them all, I mean, you're gonna have people that enforce the law. You're gonna have somewhere to put people who are too dangerous to be outside, and you're gonna have some rules so you know how to behave.
That's it. I think.
Give them a different name if you want.
You always have, like you say, you have some kind of shared social rules. Some people who transgress those things will have things that are involuntarily done to them.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that's how we discipline children, right? We subject them to all kinds of involuntary things. And the question is, what should the extent of those be? What should the purpose of those be? Retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, I that's a totally live argument. But I agree with you. The idea that you would ever detain somebody against their will, which is, I think, it's effectively you can equate that to prison, a form of involuntary detention.
Mm-hmm.
Any society is going to have a form of involuntary detention, even if it's just if somebody knocks you out and people are going to try and arbitrate what just happened, they're going to involuntarily detain that person. And then I sort of buy the argument that I think we could probably abolish the police, but I don't think we should have like non-hierarchical. We certainly could abolish the police as they presently exist.
Oh, I mean, all of these things I think can be radically transformed. But I mean, are you going to have rules? Are you going to have some people whose, in the division of labour, job it is to take responsibility for enforcing those rules and to be the person who gets called when someone breaks a rule?
And they'll be subject to very, 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 very high levels of accountability, which is presently not the case with the police. No, I totally agree with you. And Nietzsche had this. I've wanted to do this podcast for a long time, sort of critique of anarchism. Nietzsche had a critique of anarchism, and he said the problem with the anarchists is they carry the state in their heart, so they don't need the state because they've internalized all of these functions in their everyday social relations. I don't want, like you say, I don't want the fucking cop here. I'm going to monitor people, I don't want that. I want a division of labour. Let that person fucking do it, and we'll pay them, and they're more accountable, and there's equality under the law. And if they don't uphold that, then they can fuck off. Great, but I think in the Anglophone world, a lot of that kind of rationale has been jettisoned, sadly.
Well, I suppose
less in the global south.
What rationale? The rationale of
a police force or a prison system which is leftist, socialist.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's because the Western left has been so far from power for decades and decades and decades that they never actually had to think about the consequences of some of their wacky ideas.
Okay. On that note, I do broadly agree with you on quite a lot of this stuff. You know that. Michael, you've been great.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
This has been the Bastani Factor. I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm going to try and get a really good guest on. So get in the comments. Suggest who should come on. I'm going to try and get Peter Hitchens.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be really funny, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Hitchens would be good. So, yeah, get involved in the comments. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Also, suggest people there. Michael J.S. Walker.
Yeah, exactly.
He hosts Siski Sour every week. Check him out on Monday. We got Navarra FM, I believe, on Friday. Maybe not, because James is sick.
It's only Wednesday, right? I think he'll have recovered by Friday.
That's true. If it's a stomach bug, probably right. And like I say, if you like what we've done this evening, check out more of our content at NavarraMedia.com. Help us build a new media for different politics. Support.NavarraMedia.com. If there is a general election, we'll be doing content like this pretty much every day. So I've been Aaron Bastani. He's been Michael Walker. You've been great. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.